Working.
Live on Facebook.
Almost.
Well, it says it on my end. It says in the corner,
Right.
it says live on Facebook. Webinar is now streaming live on Facebook.
Hello, Facebook. Welcome, everyone. Can't see if anyone's watching yet. Let me pull it up. Guys, bear with us. We're just going to make sure that it's working. This is always the nice, awkward part.
The initial stages to make sure it's actually functioning.
Yep. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, wait, we have panelists. Okay, cool. Hey, Nicole, what's up? All right, cool. Eric, so I didn't know that we were going to have panelists.
It's a chat.
This one. Yeah, so we've got some people on the Zoom call with us, and then we've probably got 1-2 million people watching on Facebook. So look your best,
Awesome.
do your best. Cool, man. So first off, thank you so much for joining me. I know you're an incredibly busy dude, and as always, I really appreciate you carving out some time for me.
Hey, I'm busy because I do things like this. So thank you for the opportunity, and it's my pleasure. Hopefully we can help some people.
Oh yeah, man. It's always good to connect with you. So what's up with your nutrition personally right now? What are you doing?
Well, as we mentioned before we got on, I am in the process of dieting down for natural bodybuilding season of mine. So I compete in drug-free bodybuilding. So my nutrition is less than I'd like to eat, basically. So yeah. So I have a game plan over the next 8 weeks before my first show that is designed to maximally lose as much body fat as possible, retaining muscle and staying sane and still being able to perform in the gym. But yeah, so that's me.
What was the impetus for getting back into competing?
It's just what I love. So I started competing, did my first show in 07, did another show in 07, and then I did a series of 5 shows in 09, did 2 shows in 2011, and then I decided I wasn't going to get back on stage or go through the dieting process again until after I'd completed my graduate work. So I finished my PhD in 2017, and then I was training predominantly, but not exclusively, as a powerlifter and then a Olympic weightlifter a little bit. And I wanted to have a full year in 2017 to not only recover from hip surgery, but also to really focus on bodybuilding and a little more on the hypertrophy side, body composition stuff, before then taking 2019 to actually get on stage. But yeah, for me, bodybuilding has an artistic expression element. There is I think for most people, if you talk to them, the whole process of pushing yourself to your limit is kind of has some, in my experience, some cool transcendent aspects of it. It forces you way outside of your comfort zone, and you get to see kind of how far you can push yourself, which I like to try to take that into other elements of my life. So
you've transcended normal human capacity. I see this small halo right
yes
above.
It's ascendance to godhood through borderline eating disorders. That's right. So
that's awesome, man. I don't know if we told you, but we're about to start coaching people in keto, and so Dee and I are doing a 90-day keto experiment, and for the most part, it's been amazing. Immediately, I saw the mental clarity effects that I think are so well discussed. What's been most interesting for me is, before the show, I was telling you, I'm experiencing more stress and anxiety in this little chapter of my life because I have so much on my plate in my career. And what's been happening is, over and over and over, I keep thinking that I'm starving, I'm super hungry. And then if I don't give in to that sensation immediately, what I've been noticing 3 or 4 times now is that I'm either stressed or I'm hungry, or I have some kind of fear about a project that's on my plate. And we teach people about psychology of eating and developing a better relationship with food every single day. But to experience that in myself and notice those sensations, and really notice that when I'm feeling uncomfortable, my tendency is to want to cover it with eating and to feel some sense of pleasure, has been a really, really interesting, just an interesting piece of this whole diet.
A bit of self-discovery around how that can influence your eating behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
That's very good information to have. Yeah.
Anyway, man, let's get into this. So before I met you, Adi talked about you constantly. She's devoured everything that you read. We've had all of our coaches read a lot of your stuff, and I never saw a picture of you. Like, I had read articles that you had written and such, and I just thought you must be this like 60-year-old Jedi professor or something like that. And come to find out, you're average looking guy, young guy, and you're just crushing it in the nutrition world. How did you fall in love with nutrition in the first place, and how did you get into the industry?
Yeah, so that's hilarious. One, it all started with kind of me having a crisis of career. So as a young kid, we're talking like the age of 10, I had established that I wanted to get into the FBI and be like super cop man. And my life was on that trajectory. I got into the Air Force, and I tested to be able to be what's called a cryptologic linguist. So they, meaning you have to test well enough. Back then it was the ASVAB and then the D-Lab, and these tests that show whether or not you have aptitude. And I knew that the FBI liked military experience and also either counterintelligence or police experience. So I actually got the job I wanted. I was an Arabic cryptologic linguist in the Air Force for 4 years, which working in counterintelligence. And within the first like 3 months of being in the Air Force, I realized I didn't want to do that. I had no interest in it. I didn't want to work in the military or for the government. And so I experimented with music, a little bit on my creative side. And I also fell in love with lifting somewhere right before I was about to finish my enlistment. And I got into lifting because I was dealing with some stressful relationship things, and I didn't have a sense of control. And I think it started as kind of this unhealthy obsession, but eventually became something that was a very positive outlet. And man, military culture in your early 20s, that's not typically the way people deal with things. Mm-hmm. It typically is this, fast-tracked alcoholism. So fortunately, I didn't do that. I got into lifting, bodybuilding specifically. I had a few mentors early on. And I was at a crossroads where I could either go and work for the NSA, basically doing the same thing and kind of back to that original career track, but not doing something that made me happy, or just say, screw it and get a job as a member of the gym staff, the local YMCA for minimum wage. And I had a few fortunate, lucky things that happened. Like I would have had to change cities and I would have started a long distance relationship with who would then become my wife if I was to go that route. And also the first job opportunity I had was contracting, and that company lost its contract with the Air Force. So the few attempts I had at trying to take the easier, safer path of working as a contractor, that got shut down when the company lost its contract. And then when I found out that I would have to also be endangering a relationship I was in and doing something that I didn't really want to do, that's when I said, screw it. And I got that job at the YMCA. And I'm fortunate that I did not take that easy route into security and getting a job that paid very consistently and gave me much more income than most people in their early 20s would have, because that YMCA job in 2005 was what would eventually lead me to where I am today, which is a job I love and doing what I love. So my own personality is one where I get very obsessed with whatever I do, and I kind of make it fill all facets of my life. So I loved the aspects of resistance training and weightlifting and what it taught me about pushing myself. And I brought that into my job as a personal trainer, which I became, and my education, which eventually culminated in a PhD. And I've started now a handful of businesses all related to educating and supporting and trying to provide a community for lifters, primarily the drug-free bodybuilding and powerlifting community. But of course, I got love for strong men, strong women, CrossFit competitors, Olympic weightlifters, the whole 9 yards.
So what was it like for you going from like an elite military personnel to bottom of the barrel? You're at the YMCA, you're starting fresh in an entirely new industry.
Well, I'll challenge the conception of being an elite member of the military. Being a cryptologic linguist sounds a lot more exciting than it is. What it ended up being for me was listening to static for 12 hours a day in a windowless room.
I remember you telling me that.
Yeah. It wasn't like I was Jason Bourne. So I was very happy to get out of that. And I was scared, but I also had I had a safety net. While I don't come from a background that provided me the ability just to pay for and go to college, I don't have like a very well-off family, but the military ended up creating a safety net for me. So I would still go back and do it again. It also taught me a lot about myself, and I think structure and hard work, but it gave me the GI Bill. So I was able to get paid to go to school afterwards. And it also allowed me a 6-month period of collecting unemployment when I finished my enlistment. So I had time to start to figure things out. So I was definitely intimidated, and I was scared, but I was also super excited, and just seeing where I could go. And I used, the 2-year period they spend teaching you Arabic provides you basically with a ton of college credits, and I didn't have to take any electives. I basically could go right into my core coursework pretty early on. So I was able to finish a bachelor's, I think, in 2011, and then start my master's that same year. So yeah, it was, to answer your question, it was intimidating, but also very exciting.
So since then, you've become one of the fathers of flexible dieting, which is one of the things that we teach at WAG. What was your process from going from working at the YMCA to finding flexible dieting to becoming an authority in it?
Man, I think it was, well, first, thank you. And there's definitely a lot of people who have come before me to,
yeah, they're grandfathers. You're just a father.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So my great grandparents, I got to acknowledge them. But yeah, so I think it started with a bit of Dunning-Kruger, thinking that I knew a lot more than I did, and then seeing that I wasn't effective with my clients, and then looking back and saying, well, I might have been effective, but there might have been some downsides. So it's always easy to look back with kind of rosy colored glasses, but it started with me writing, meal plans for people when I had no business to do so. Not even realizing that writing meal plans is outside of the scope of practice of a trainer. And also having some misconceptions from a limited knowledge base, like, oh, you can't combine carbs and fats because they'll create fat storage. And, generally making hard to follow, overly strict meal plans, and teaching and treating all of my clients like they were me, treating them like they wanted to be bodybuilders, regardless of what their goals were. And simply put, I was a pretty bad personal trainer initially. I was outside of my scope of practice, and I didn't know how to empathize with my clients. And I figured that what worked for me would work for everyone. And I think as I became more engaged with kind of the intellectual side of it, started studying, teaching myself, engaging with people online, having my beliefs challenged, and also just seeing failure as a coach, and then realizing that me blaming it on them for not following this ridiculous meal plan, it's not really on them, it's on me, and becoming more open-minded to my own faults, I think, was the pathway forward. My acknowledgement that I didn't really know as much as I thought I did was ironically how I got to learn. So my first entry into what you would call flexible dieting was probably putting the quote, if it fits your macros approach on too much of a pedestal.
Mhm.
So this is where, the basic presumption is, hey, the amount of what you eat has a much larger impact on body composition than exactly what those food sources are. We don't have to follow these overly restrictive diets of chicken, broccoli, and rice and tuna and nothing else. I can give you a great amount of carbs, fat, and protein, and that's going to solve all your problems. And I think it's really important, something I didn't realize then, but that I realize now, is that, yeah, that is a flexible diet compared to a super rigid bodybuilding diet of broccoli, chicken, and rice, because it allows you more options than those three things. But if you were to take someone off the street who walks into a personal training office, who's never tracked macros before, has never counted calories, doesn't know what a carb, fat, or protein is, has never used MyFitnessPal, and has never used a food scale, and you tell them, hey, I have the solution to all your problems, you just have to weigh and track your food and yourself for the rest of your life and you'll be great, you sound like you're crazy, and that's potentially harmful and more importantly, just ineffective advice to give them.
Right.
So I think I had the second coming of age where I was now treating people the same way, but just with a little more knowledge. And I didn't start to see the fallibility and the issues around an overly strict, if it fits your macros approach for another couple of years, which is when I think I really started to get good and savvy, because I had started working as a coach for a long enough time and using if it fits your macros as more of a tool to say, hey, let's quantify your energy intake. Think about what foods fit into certain areas and probably where your macronutrients should lie. And then how do we find ways to work that into your lifestyle? And then do we use that as a long-term tool, or is this just something that we used to teach you and then we transition to something that is much more habitual? That's eventually where I got to, but that was a process of years.
So how have you seen flexible dieting as a way of eating evolve over the past 10 years?
Good question. So the roots of flexible dieting actually come from studies that were started in the late 90s by Weston colleagues. And they identified that there's basically two types of restraint. So restraint is basically a requirement if you are going to try to follow a weight loss diet, because if you didn't need restraint, you would just lose weight regardless. And there are issues with restraint that we can get into later, but how you restrain yourself seemed to predict some things. So they created a scale whereby that element of restraint, which you can measure with a psychological metric, like you give someone a questionnaire and you can get a restraint score. They added a little more to it so they could determine whether or not you used a flexible or rigid restraint approach. Now, the difference between those two is that rigid restraint is basically based on black and white thinking. There are good foods, there are bad foods. I'm on the diet, I'm off the diet. While flexible restraint has an understanding of that the dosage kind of makes the poison, if you will. It's not just good foods or bad foods, but how much of this food do I have? And if I have, say, a bunch of fries with a burger at lunch, then I'm going to make a different decision at dinner. And if I have a friend who comes in out of town and we grab a pizza and have some beers afterwards, and the next day I'm going to be a little more controlled my diet. So it has this granularity and it has this kind of auto-regulation aspect to it. And it may require also just some basic understanding about nutrition, kind of like the whole concept of energy balance. And there were some really striking associations between people who had a flexible restraint mindset versus rigid. Those who had a rigid restraint mindset were typically higher in body weight, scored much higher in rate of eating disorders, were unhappier, were unsuccessful losing weight, and regained weight more often. So basically, they were unsuccessful, lost weight less effectively, and were losing their sanity in the process. While those who were flexible restrainers typically could lose weight, keep it off, and also were less psychologically affected by the process. So that's where the original research came from, and that's where the first times you'll find words similar to flexible dieting. After that, it started to become defined by a system rather than the mindset. So there's many, many systems out there that you could argue are flexible. Probably the most popular one that kind of took its roots in the bodybuilding community is the if it fits your macros approach, which is basically saying, hey, you can have whatever you want so long as you preserve your energy balance by having targets for carbs, fat, and protein. And of course, there's other ways of doing this. I think probably the most popular would be Weight Watchers, which is the point-based system that we all know based on the diabetic exchange. And that's just basically assigning foods points based on their calorie content. And instead of having to track protein, carbs, and fat, you would just think about points based on what food you ate. So in the kind of niche online bodybuilding community, if it fits your macros flourished and became quote unquote flexible dieting. And then Weight Watchers, it was probably the most popular form of a if it fits your, or counting strategy that wasn't too focused on good or bad foods. And this kind of created a war in some of these nutrition communities, and especially in bodybuilding. You had the folks who came from a clean versus dirty eating or good versus bad food background. And then we're talking like 2000, mid 2000s all the way till like 2010, 11, 12. This was kind of the theme. You'd have people arguing with science in a very simple message that weight loss is about calories in versus calories out, versus people saying, hey, no, good foods, bad foods. And in the bodybuilding community, no, it's that works, but it's not optimal. And you would have people on both sides getting in great shape and accomplishing amazing things. And I think both camps, because it became this war, lost a lot of information, because once you go to war with someone else, you no longer consider their side at all. That's not respectful disagreement. And I think I have these values that are a little bit different than yours. So I see what you're saying, but I think this works better. That's going, everything you do is wrong. And I am the truth and the light, and you are the devil. So for example, it is true that energy balance dictates weight loss. And every single study we've ever had in a metabolic ward where people only get access to the food they get, and we can actually measure all of their energy expenditure, weight loss occurs if you put them in an energy deficit. It doesn't matter what you feed them. That doesn't mean it's the healthiest way to go, the best way to maintain body composition, maintain performance, or the happiest way to live life. But from a purely mechanistic, in a lab perspective, energy balance dictates changes in body mass. So that's true. But saying that the solution to the obesity epidemic is to move more and eat less is saying that the solution to depression is to be happy. So it's largely not useful, and it doesn't treat people like people. And I think that's because it came from the bodybuilding community, where you put willpower on a pedestal and you're willing to do anything to get your goals. And I don't think that translates well to regular people. Bodybuilders we're abnormal. So anyway, one of the biggest pieces that was lost on that side was saying, hey, well, why do people overeat? Doesn't matter. Just eat less, and here's the numbers to do it, and you can eat what you want. You just control your portion sizes. Okay, great. So on the other side, while there's some science denialism that came on the kind of good food, bad food approach, they were doing a lot of things that were helpful habitually, like focusing primarily on lean proteins, fruits and vegetables, and the quote unquote good foods list, so long as it's not too restrictive, ends up with someone being less hungry, more satiated, and having a very good profile of both micronutrients and macronutrients, even if they don't necessarily know that that's what's doing it, even if they think it's this magic list of good foods. And doing things like having a set number of meals per day, and eliminating the number of choices you have to make. Like I cook on Sunday and I get my Tupperware and I have, broccoli and a meat source, and I cycle these things through. There's a lot of skills to be learned there. And if you can take the best of both worlds, it's much better. So what I started to see among the camp that I was in, which is that if it fits your macros community, was that as a bodybuilding coach, people were struggling a lot because they were chasing cravings as they got deeper and deeper into diets. They were trying to fill an unfillable hole. And they were doing things like eating, low fat, sugar alcohol based, like candy treats to fit into their minuscule calorie budget, and not thinking like, maybe I'd be a lot fuller if I actually focused on fruits and vegetables and lean proteins. So, and also like freestyling their macros every day and being proud of the fact that they could fit whatever they wanted. But in the end, they're just constantly focusing on food. And there's this phenomenon you see in bodybuilders where like their meal prep time goes from like 10 minutes and when they're 30 weeks out, and it goes to like 45 minutes per meal when they're 4 weeks out, because they're just thinking about how hungry they are and they become so food focused. And so anyway, in the microcosm of bodybuilding, it makes a lot more sense to develop all these habits, but just understand what the calorie and macronutrient breakdown of it is, instead of forgetting all that and thinking about which foods are going to be more satiating. And then in the off season, when you're probably full all the time, which foods might be less satiating. It's really hard to say quote unquote bulk on broccoli and chicken. So understanding the effects of food on hunger, and then those downstream effects on your energy intake, or the ease of being in a deficit or a surplus, is really important. And that was something that was lost in that war. Another thing was that the translating of those nutritional lessons went really poorly to the general public, because your average bodybuilder knows a lot about nutrition because you have to. There's no way to get in shape for the stage unless you know how to manipulate your nutrition to some degree. So taking someone who knows nothing about nutritional science and saying, hey, here's 3 numbers, is typically disastrous. It doesn't respect their basic level of knowledge. It doesn't respect their lifestyle. And there's really no mentorship for them to actually be able to take those lessons into the real world. So the evolution of flexible dieting is gone from, hey, there's such a thing as thinking about food differently in a way that might help you, to here's some systems, to now we're going to war with these systems, lose information. And now I think if it fits your macros community is finally coming around to the idea that it's a lot more than just 3 numbers, especially when you're dealing with uneducated populations, and that it's not sustainable to track numbers your whole life. I actually tracked my macros from 2007 until 2012 for 5 years straight before I went back. So I was borderline disordered eating for a while, thinking that I was in the flexible dieting camp. And realizing that the human body is always going to be better than a system if you can fully tap into its awareness and all of its systems, right? Our awareness, like you were talking about, how you notice that when you're in a certain psychological state, you're more prone for your hunger levels to be higher, right? Another example would be paying attention to which pre-workout carb sources go easiest on your stomach, so you can train within a reasonable time frame, but doesn't result in you kind of bonking halfway through. Or noticing, I'm always hungry at night, so maybe I'm going to backload my calories a little more because I'm never hungry in the morning. All of these things, and thinking about the experience of eating and how do you work those in so you can get these feedback signals, so you can understand how much I should eat at what times and what foods, can be combined with that nutritional knowledge to get an even better output than just rigidly following 3 numbers no matter what. So now I coach my bodybuilders towards not tracking when they get to the off season, because it's almost impossible to actually get on stage without having that restraint, like I talked about, and controlling your intake to some degree. But using hunger and satiety instead of ignoring them and just focusing on numbers is something that I really do focus on in the off season. And I try to get that skill back, because there's consequences. If you focus entirely on external cues, you lose touch with the internal cues, which you may have to do at certain times for your goals, but you don't want that to be your steady state all the time. So that was a long answer to your question, but that's
Eric,
what I got.
you remind me of my dog Otis. Whenever I leave the house, I give Otis a little bone, and I come back 6 hours later and he's still chewing on that same bone. I throw a question your way and we're like at the end of the interview. You're the man.
Well, the good news is you can just ask me a question, and if you need to go do some work, I can just sit here and talk to the screen.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. You're an incredibly unique person in that you understand nutrition science to a degree that most people never will even touch. But then you also understand the behavioral piece, the how do I translate this in a way that people can actually follow and in a way that will actually land to them. So I just want to acknowledge you for being a very unique individual. As nutrition coaches, we are really in the compliance game, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're what we do is largely dictated by what we can translate to people and get them to actually understand. With that said, what are some of the biggest psychological hangups that get in the way of people actually succeeding and complying with a diet?
And that the black and white mindset is a huge doozy for people. And I don't know that I've said the word doozy before in like I feel like I accomplished something just by using that in the
Ladies
discussion.
and gentlemen, you heard it here first.
So anyway, so I think a lot of athletes, especially, you'll find this is really common. Like, I'm an all or nothing person. Like I tend to be all in or all out, and they see that as a strength sometimes, or just, oh, that's just my personality. But I have found that is a barrier, if not changed, when it comes to nutrition. If the only way you know how to be on plan is to go all in and just commit to it and change your whole life, that's typically not sustainable. And any athlete knows, or anyone who has lost a lot of weight and kept it off knows that consistency is the game, not these hot streaks. And what inevitably happens when you're pushing towards a hard goal through body composition change that requires nutritional focus is that you're going to slip up. So being able to slip up in a way that isn't devastating is really important. And that happens rarely when you've got that black and white mindset. The whole idea of, I had one cookie, I'm off the diet because that wasn't on my diet plan. I blew it. I might as well eat the whole bag. Logically, we know that doesn't make sense. That's like, I think people have said this before, and it's a popular meme now, that having one cookie and then eating the whole bag because you blew your diet is like getting a flat tire, and instead of getting out and changing it, you get out and stab all 4 tires, right?
I haven't seen that one.
It makes a lot of sense too. It's not helpful, The only difference is that you don't enjoy stabbing your tires, but you do enjoy eating the cookies. But it's kind of like this
stabbing other people's tires, though, right?
Right, there you go. Like nail manufacturers, that's whose tires you stab. But yeah, and if you understand it, that all stems from this idea that I'm either on or off the diet. It's black or white. Instead of being able to go, right, I had a cookie, maybe I'm a little over today, but I can do something about that at tomorrow or at dinner, etc. Having if-then statements, having fallback plans, I think is really, really important. So probably the biggest pitfall is having that black or white mindset. I think behaviorally, that's a huge one. Another one of the most common things I run into, especially in kind of the bodybuilding, body composition world, is people who try to stay too lean. And think that if they just find the right diet, they can maintain the body that they see in their Instagram person they follow, who that's probably a picture they took 6 months ago, and it's might be photoshopped, and they have probably better genetics than you, and hey, they might even be on anabolic steroids. So there's a lot more going on there than simply thinking that's realistic. But I've done hundreds of consultations with people, and sometimes early on, they'll say, hey, this is my 4th time trying to get lean and stay lean. And sometimes the problem is just simply that their expectations for what they can maintain don't match up with their desires. And that's not really fixable with nutrition. Mm-hmm. That's fixable only by having a perspective shift and kind of asking themselves, what do I really care about? Or am I really going to be a better person if I can see a 6-pack instead of a 4-pack? Is that going to actually change my life? And I think some people are often trying to fix something that's a bigger problem, a deeper problem, I should say, by modifying their appearance instead of it being a little more holistic. So yeah, I think those are the 2 issues I run into the most, having that black or white mindset and then not having necessarily realistic expectations.
Yeah, one of the interesting things you kind of touched on is kind of identifying your obstacles ahead of time. I was interviewing a sports psychologist recently who told me it's between 60 and 80%. People who identify obstacles in the way of their goals beforehand are 60 to 80% more likely to achieve their goals. So if your goal is to lose 10 pounds and you know one of your obstacles is every time I eat out, I tend to blow my macros. If you can identify that and come up with a strategy to use or multiple strategies, you might not succeed every time, but you're going to be so much more likely to, because you've planned it out, right? It's just like being a member of a football team. And if the defense changes up their formation on you, you have fallback plans to dealing with that defense. It's the same exact thing. What are some other mindsets that get in the way of people complying and succeeding long-term on a diet?
I think what you just brought up is a really good one. Kind of having your blinders on and thinking that everyone's going to go perfectly is a really bad idea. And I totally agree. Like, for example, one of the most useful strategies that I have is I don't set people up to fail. So like anytime you work with someone like for a year, which is not uncommon these days with some of the coaching setups we have, they're going to have a vacation or there's going to be the holidays. And sometimes the knee-jerk reaction you get from a client is just, I can stick to it for that period. You know, we can just make it work. I have bodybuilders all the time who want to go on vacation, but they don't want to lose a week of dieting. So they're going to go on vacation. They're going to make it work. And I always go, let's not be crazy. Let's make it a diet break. Let's make it a controlled effort to not gain weight. That's the only thing we're trying to do. We just don't want to take a step back. Or if it is a step back, it's just a small little shuffle step. And that gives you practice at maintenance outside of a bodybuilding context. That gives you the ability to know what it's like to transition out of the diet mindset to a bit more maintenance. And that's going to help you down the track when you actually get to your goal. But I think a lot of people, they have the mindset that hurts them is they are too focused on the achievement of the goal versus the maintenance of the goal once they get there, which in and of itself is the obstacle to maintaining it, right? Like the conversation I typically have with someone when they tell me they're following some diet, whether it's, you know, like keto or a vegan diet or intermittent fasting or something that can work but is not necessary but may be quite restrictive, is I ask them, well, how's that working for you? You know, and then the second question I ask, if all that's going well, is, you know, what's the game plan afterwards? And sometimes you get kind of this like, oh, I didn't think about that. Or, you know, like, so if, like, obviously you're not going to maintain a diet, right? Because you shouldn't be dieting. You should be going back to maintenance in a strict sense. But if you knew that the way you ate beforehand led you to a place you didn't want to be, and the only change you know how to make is something extreme, then what comes after? What do you transition to? You've been on both sides of the spectrum. You've been to a place that is just doing your thing and resulting in a body that's unhealthy or that you're not happy with, and then something crazy that does work, but is not sustainable. So getting the practice and the acknowledgement that there's something in the middle and new habits and new lifestyles need to be developed is really important. And I think just simply having that knowledge is a huge, like you said, related to the sports psychologist, being able to plan for the future and plan for obstacles that may come forward in a kind of a meta sense, right, nutritionally, I think is really important.
So let's dive further into that. So we know that we need to identify obstacles and come up with strategies for overcoming them. Really what this is replacing a bad habit with a good habit. What are some ways that you get people to actually be aware of when they're about to fall into an old bad pattern, and then B, actually stick to it, actually stick to a new positive habit?
That's a good question. It's very population specific. So with the general population, this starts with some really simple nutritional literacy, right? I think it's easy for us as nutrition coaches or athletes or bodybuilders especially to assume a certain level of knowledge. You know, like your client might still be someone who thinks like nuts are high in protein. Like, yeah, nuts have some protein in them, but they're largely fat. You know, your client might not be someone who realizes that a salad they get at a restaurant is actually really high calories because it's doused in dressing. They just think salad equals healthy. When you look at research, if you take a picture of food and then you add vegetables to it, the average person thinks that somehow subtracts calories. You've added food, but the calories have gotten less. If I eat broccoli with a burger, the burger now has less energy.
Oh, shit. That's it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But it's very intuitive. It makes sense.
Yeah, and so that's the way people think. Like, the more good foods I have in my diet, the better everything will be, and they kind of cancel out bad foods rather than it actually being energy, right? So if someone doesn't even have that basic level of knowledge, then they have far fewer tools that can then become habits that therefore replace bad habits. So it starts with some nutritional literacy. So for example, most people, general pop, they get hung up because they eat out a lot, right? Or because they cook for their family and their family likes these certain foods and they're in an awkward position where they don't feel like they can change their family. So they've got to go out to eat. Maybe they've got limited options where they go out to eat lunch and they cook for a family who's not all on board with this. What do I do with that? That's so common. Nutritional literacy helps you understand that you can replace certain things with lower calorie options, that you can get leaner cuts of meat. It helps you understand that you can make things like cauliflower rice. It helps you understand that you can bulk up meals with vegetables if you season and cook them well. It's really tasty, but man, you can cut the calories in half. It helps you understand that you can make desserts that are way lower in calories that are still quite tasty. It helps you understand that, no, I shouldn't be getting that salad. Maybe I should order the fish and just ask for, steamed vegetables as a side, that kind of thing. And then being able to change your palate over time, I think that's a really big part of it too. If someone has had bad, quote unquote, bad nutritional habits, or you don't really have the palate for some of the foods. And I think when you just have someone immediately go to like all quote unquote good foods, that's typically not successful. So I think it needs to be kind of a stepwise transition. And you have to create nutritional literacy and also the awareness of what your current habits are. So one of the first things that I do after teaching that basic literacy, which is essentially going, what foods are high in protein, what foods are high in carbohydrates and fat, and what foods are high in calories, and what are calories, what is energy balance, how does this whole thing work? Okay, great. That's really all you need to know. Then I have someone just log their food, not with any specific target, not necessarily needing to throw everything on the scale, but just writing down what they eat, how much of it, why, and how they felt. A lot of this brings you to the front part of your brain instead of kind of acting in that very emotional state of I'm eating because there's food there and it being kind of this mindless eating. Things happen when you ask people just to track their behaviors. You went back and grabbed the donut off the desk at work because it was there and you ate it. You may not even remember that you did that 3 hours later. But if you have to think about and write everything down, you might not even choose to eat the donut. And then maybe the donut's fine in the context of everything else, but now you're aware of it and you can think about it. And we have a lot of data on mindful eating, people who sit down, eat undistracted. They're not looking at a screen. They're not watching anything. They just make eating the same ritual has always been for humans, that they consume less food. So being able to bring mindfulness back and then connect, like you were talking about, when I'm in a certain emotional state, I make these nutrition choices. That opens up the door to new possibilities. So if they have the knowledge to know what new habits exist, and if they know the underlying emotions that lead to their current habits, that's the only way you can really move forward to being okay. So if we can manage your stress, make better decisions, if we can grocery shop and have the preparation there, we can keep your stress lower, and now you know that you can do other things. Now we can start, walking in these new behaviors. But the door isn't even open until you start to do some of those basic things. So that's general pop. When you're working with athletes, sometimes you have to do a bit of myth busting on the front end, and you're dealing with fear more often. So for example, I've coached a version of myself many times, the person who tracked macros for 5 years and was super, super diligent about making sure that the diet was quote unquote optimal all the time. getting someone away from tracking numbers, I think, is really important, and actually reconnecting with their hunger and their satiety. And I typically do this one in a stepwise fashion. So let's say I've dieted someone all the way down to the stage level where we were tracking protein, carbs, and fat within 10 grams apiece with targets. And they're incredibly hungry throughout that whole process, because that's what happens when you get down to essential levels of body fat. They might have been successful on stage, but now we no longer have the goal of getting down to this unhealthy level of leanness for their competitive purposes. And we need to get back to a healthy off season where their goal is to put on muscle mass. Now we need to get back to a healthier place where their hormones are functioning. They're not constantly hungry. They're not food focused, etc. And that comes both behaviorally and physiologically. Yes, adding food, gaining some body fat, that will help the physiological side of it. But they've been so focused on tracking everything and doing the best they can to ignore their hunger that now that's a problem. Now they don't know what full feels like. They don't know the difference between cravings and actual hunger. And they don't know how to manage that any other way besides, I've got these limits and there are these three numbers. And it's easy to follow those when you tie them to, I have to get on stage. And when the stage goes away, now these just become three unrealistic targets that you're going to go over and then feel bad about. Right. So I like to shift people away from 3 macros to protein and calories, to eventually just hitting a protein target and then paying attention to hunger and satiety and using the scale as a feedback system so they can see, okay, I can't fully trust my hunger because now I'm gaining weight really quickly. So I need to be slightly less full at each meal. So they can kind of bring in those qualitative elements and then retrain their hunger and satiety to become useful signals that align with their goals. And that can take months each season that they do that. So
what an interesting, tactful way of just helping people become more aware of themselves. That's awesome.
Yeah, and it's not easy, especially in either case, just for very different reasons, right?
Right. So at the beginning of any diet, for the most part, people are really motivated, right? They've gone through all the stages of change and they are ready to do something about their problem, right? With that said, after a certain period of time, most people either lose some or all of that motivation, right? It's, what is it, February 4th. We had people that were so fired up to make a change with their New Year's resolutions. It's already been almost 5 weeks. And a lot of those people are already waning in their motivation to continue doing whatever their resolution was. So what strategies do you have to help people re-engage with their commitment to themselves and keep their motivation to continue doing what they're doing?
A real practical one is strategic diet breaks. So kind of going back to that car analogy, people typically go off their diet not by planning and sort of by choice, but essentially, do you change your oil to make sure your car doesn't break down, or do you wait till your car breaks down and think, oh, I need an oil change, right? We get that with our cars. We bring them in every 3,000 miles or whatever it's supposed to be, every 3 months or 4 months. But with our diets, we basically just redline it until we can no longer stay on it. And like you said, motivation wanes. And then the convergence of a dinner date opportunity that you otherwise could have had the willpower to push through, and you being hungry happens. And next thing you know is you've got rib juice all over your fancy white shirt, right? And you're disappointed with yourself. And then the next day you think screw it. So one of the really practical solutions to that, and we actually have a cool study on it now, is having planned diet breaks. So for example, every 4 to 8 weeks, you take a week where you intentionally are trying to eat by your best approximation of a healthy, normal human who's not starving or really, really hungry. And the goal is to simply not gain much weight. Like I said, it's that don't take a step backwards. And it gives you not only practice at maintenance and practice at what life might look like when you're done dieting, but it also gives you both a physiological and a psychological break from the diet to kind of bring your head above water. And I think it's really important that these diet breaks are still tracked and measured and weighed and planned to some degree. You're still making smart decisions. You're still eating similar amounts of foods. It's just you're increasing the portion sizes. And maybe you don't do cardio that week. Maybe you allow yourself to go out to eat once if you're not doing that on your diet, et cetera, but you're making better choices. So it's all of these opportunities to practice while also giving you some of that relief from being just kind of on the grind and having a limited food list and a meal schedule, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a cool study done by Byrne and colleagues in 2017 where they compared two groups. One group of overweight and obese men who just dieted for 16 weeks straight on a set caloric deficit, and the other group that would diet 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So a total of 16 weeks of dieting passed, but every other 2-week period, they were eating at maintenance, still tracking, and they were so off the diet every 2 weeks. And not only did they find they lost more fat mass by the end of the period, although it took twice as long, they also maintained their metabolic rate at a higher level. So they didn't see as much adaptive thermogenesis, which makes dieting a little harder as you burn fewer calories. And then at the 6-month follow-up, they had maintained significantly more weight loss, I think by 50% compared to the other group, presumably because not only were they physiologically more resistant to weight gain as their metabolism hadn't adapted as much, but probably more importantly, they had gotten every 2 weeks practice at eating at maintenance. So this is a very cool study that I think tells you a little bit about a strategy that could be useful. Some people are resistant to it because they go, oh, but it'll take me 32 weeks instead of 16. And I'm like, well, you don't have to do it 2 on, 2 off. You could do 4 on, 1 off. But more importantly, what's the rush? You're going to live in your body your whole life. Last time I checked, and completing a diet block and then just having to lose that weight a couple of years later is actually the problem. That mindset is what's there. You have to get out of the mindset of thinking dieting as a phase, and rather I want to modify my lifestyle so that my body aligns with my goals and who I want to be and where I want to go. And that is something that doesn't come from reading some book and giving you a 30-day challenge or something like that. It really does come from a lifestyle change perspective. And I think diet breaks really help someone turn that corner.
Yeah, it's a way to instill moderation like immediately, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than going super, super hard and then all of a sudden trying to learn how to maintain. It teaches you while you're going through the process. That's awesome.
Absolutely. And also I think it probably improves adherence on the diet. When you're into like say day 12 of your 2-week block before you're going on your 2-week maintenance break, you're probably not going to crack, right? You're going to go, hey, in 2 days, I get to eating 500 more calories per day. And you forget because you think of relative suffering, right? You think like compared to the way you were living your life before, your diet breaks are annoying. You're still tracking your calories. You're still aware. You're still making the right choices on the menu. You're eating at maintenance. It's controlled in some way. But compared to the 2 weeks of dieting where you're eating, say, 1,800 calories versus 2,400 and not doing cardio, it's a walk in the park. It's a relief. It's a recharging period. So you're developing these maintenance lifestyle habits that are actually harder than what you were doing pre-diet, but a lot closer to what your long-term habits should look like. So it's a cool strategy for sure.
It's called trickery. That's
exactly
trickery right there.
It's magicianing. Yeah.
All right, I got a couple more questions for you. While that's going on, guys, if you're on this Zoom call with us, go ahead and start leaving some questions. We've got some of our alumni members on the call. These are Jedis of nutrition. I expect only the best, most well thought out and articulated questions from these folks. So go ahead and leave that in the chat, guys. So you're the godfather of flexible dieting. I just decided I'm going to try to, through our interviews and live cast, I'm going to try to instill that into the world. And yet you must have people that you look up to. Who do you look up to as a coach and or leader?
Dr. Joe Klemczewski. He was actually the first kind of science-based nutrition coach who used a flexible dieting approach. I ran into him, not physically, but I started reading his articles in Natural Bodybuilding and Fitness magazine in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And he was probably the first person to start doing like online nutrition coaching in the bodybuilding space. And he would give people target macronutrients. and he would help them build kind of meal templates. So like, hey, you want to have your anchor meal here, which will give you enough satiety until your next meal. And you want to make sure you have a protein serving in each meal. You want to have a vegetable serving in each meal, but you can switch that protein serving up. You can switch the vegetables up. Here's probably where you want your fruit or your carb based on when you're training. And those can be rotated through as well. And by the way, you should be hitting these target calories, target macros, and pay attention to when you're hungriest and what foods tend to delay that hunger. And, using things like, soluble fiber and more bulked up meals strategically in different places, and individualizing like your meal frequency, and discussing things around, appropriate macronutrient breakdowns, and really just a decade before his time, and he's still around, and he's doing a lot of good work in both the general population and the kind of the bodybuilding sector, and just a good human as well. So he's a big shout out to Joe Klimczewski.
Love it, dude. What's something that you used to believe that you no longer believe? Something that you've changed your mind about in the last couple of years?
I think I'll give you one, because I actually have a number of them. But I used to be a lot. Say again?
I'll say we'll go with that, and that'll take about 20 minutes, so that'll be perfect.
So I'll stick with an easy one since you brought it up when we first started talking. I used to be a lot more anti-low carb diet, anti-ketogenic diet early on. And now that we have a lot more research, I'm not anti-low carb per se, because I think we have enough data now to show that it's just as effective for fat loss. And I think if someone goes into it eyes wide open and they understand that, insulin isn't the only sole determining factor of fat loss, and that, the energy balance equation still works, it can be a useful tool. If you put someone on a low carb, higher fat diet, immediately they're going to be eating more proteins and typically more vegetables, and focusing on a more variety of fat sources. So you end up it's easier to follow some of the healthier dieting approaches. In some clinical populations, it can be helpful. And I think it's certainly, if you're not doing a lot of anaerobic work, it probably won't harm your performance. So in my circle of powerlifters and bodybuilders, it's definitely an approach you can take that won't get in the way. And we do have enough data now to know that some people might do better on a higher fat, more moderate carb approach than the opposite. It's pretty individualized. So I don't think it is just like a non-starter like I used to. I would say be aware that it is inherently more restrictive, like you can't eat carbs, obviously. But it might be worth trying at some point in your career, just to see how you feel, how you like it, and then how you might modify it. I find most people don't stay on a hardcore ketogenic diet, but they do modify it if they like it. And other people, they just try it and they go, I have no reason to do this. This doesn't benefit me in any way. And some of the unique properties of it are that for the first, depending on the study, say 3 to 5 weeks, I would say confidently, there does seem to be a suppression of hunger that is above and beyond just the protein intake. So it can kind of result in this feeling of I'm dieting without trying to diet in terms of the hunger for the first month or so, which can be a nice, easy way to lose some body fat. However, people typically say again.
It's only in the first month or so, and you're still talking about keto, right?
Yep, talking about keto. Yeah, that's typically you see a reduction in ad libitum food intake that is independent of having a higher protein intake. It probably has to do with shifting of fuel sources, and there's a number of mechanisms which could be underlying it there. And then it starts to creep back up. We ran a study for 8 weeks in a case series of 5 lifters, and four out of the 5 of them just dropped their calories without trying to. It was ad libitum, eat as much as you want, and lost weight, lost skin folds, and then it creeped back up and they maintained just a lower body weight. Didn't happen to everybody. And it doesn't necessarily change the fact that you may not get to eat what you want. Like, we don't just eat for hunger, which I think is really important to acknowledge. It's part of culture. It's a part of celebration. It's a part of connecting with people. And we eat because we like the way food tastes. So if you just simply cannot eat anything with carbohydrates in it, you may get diet fatigue even though you're not hungry. It's just restrictive. So it's not for everybody, but it does have some advantages. If you're someone who is a little more of a abstainer versus a moderator in the way you typically approach diets, not uncommon, and you don't find that difficult, and you like to draw hard lines in the sand, and you do have a finite period where you can then transition back to more normal eating, I think a low carb diet could work very well for, say, that 4 to 6 week period where it is relatively easy and you just go about your day, especially if you're busy, and then you can go back and go, right, did that. And so long as you have all those transitioning back to normal life strategies that we've talked about in place, then that could be sustained fat loss that you achieved with relatively easier time than you might have with a more moderate approach.
Right. Long term, I don't see, well, there's a 0% chance I'm sticking to it long term, like just keto.
Yeah.
And what I know I will take away from it that's very valuable is I'll have a different relationship with processed foods. I'm not entirely sure if what like the positive benefits I'm getting are from just being fueled by ketones and that I'm fat adapted, or the lack of processed foods. But with all of the research that's coming out about the perils of a high processed carbohydrate diet, I know that I'll eat significantly less after this, which has been a really good, for a long time I was paleo when I first got into CrossFit and had great results. I felt great. And then over time, just let it really creep back in. And so I'll definitely take that out of this diet, which has been really beneficial.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, being able to eat largely single item food ingredients is a good way to go, regardless of what school of thought you follow. I think until recently, everyone agreed like fruits, vegetables, and lean proteins are a good way to go. And I say until recently because of this carnivore nonsense. But nonetheless, while it is true, like I talked about earlier, it all comes down to energy balance. There is, processed food is kind of a buzzword, but I also don't expect everyone to understand the nuances of food processing. Like if someone is deathly, I don't think fear should be driving someone's nutritional decisions. If you have a fear of processed food, the problem is the fear, not the processed food. Because I could ask you what processes are you afraid of? And often the answer is, I don't know. Like, I just know that highly engineered food is bad. I go, why is it bad? And like, oh, I heard this. And I go, well, like whey protein, heavily processed, pretty good for you, And so there's a lot of examples where I think we need to get beyond processed equals bad, but also realize that a large amount of food in its natural state provides us more micronutrients. And this comes down to what I call a inclusive versus an exclusive mindset. And I think that's a really valuable mindset to have, is that a healthy diet is not one that consists of removing everything that you have been scared into thinking is unhealthy, but rather including a lot of foods that we know to be healthy, like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, things like that, nuts, tubers, etc. All those single ingredient food items that I was mentioning. And we actually have good data to show that if you take that whole exclusive approach too far, it actually results in problems. Like if you look at food surveys of bodybuilders from the 80s and 90s, where they were keeping their food list very, very narrow in an effort to be maximally healthy and have an ultimate body composition, they had very predictable micronutrient deficiencies. And that's a common thing you'll see. If you have this long list of foods that are bad and a very small list of foods that are good, I probably need to turn that on its head a little bit. If you look at some of the blue zones where people live the longest, one of them is Okinawa, where they have some of the highest food variety of any culture on the planet. And I think acknowledging that we're a pretty resilient species and that we're not very fragile, and that it's nothing wrong with having a Snickers bar once a week, I think is also a very good mindset to have as well. So yeah, it's having this inclusive mindset, eating a lot of good, healthy foods, and then having some things that make you feel like you're allowed to be an adult every now and again. Like, and I'm going to have a frozen yogurt, or I'm going to have a dessert, or I'm going to have, I'm going to hit up McDonald's once a week because I want to, because I'm allowed to, damn it. And because it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. I think having like probably the 80-20 rule is a good example of this. 80% of your diet are those single ingredient food items, and you have the 20% that are quote unquote discretionary calories.
Right.
And understanding that there's no such thing as a bad food, that regardless of the dose, regardless of the frequency, you have it once and it measurably harms your health, your performance, or your body composition. It doesn't exist, whether that is trans fatty acids, alcohol, it all comes down to the dosage and the frequency. And I think it's important to remind yourself about that these aren't just harmful, evil things that are gonna hurt us. So, so it's kind of that balancing act of understanding that, you don't want a diet dominated by processed foods, but we also don't want to act out of fear.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Godfather. You're the man, dude. Thank you for that. Thank you for that reminder. So guys, do you know how to use the Q&A button over there? The chat function? You got any questions? We'll keep it open for another couple minutes. Maybe 60 seconds, because a couple minutes could get awkward. We're live to millions of people right now.
Are there questions in the Facebook group?
Let me check.
There's probably too many if there's actually millions.
I'm totally kidding.
Biggest Facebook group of all time.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, there's no questions. So I'm wondering if they don't know how to use the question thing. Oh, here we go. Eric's so thorough, he answered anything that I could think of. Larry Jones, kissing ass, man. I'm just kidding. I couldn't agree more. Let's see here. Yep, well, it's not working for me because I don't have the Facebook app. Got to delete those social media apps off the phone,
I hear you.
Eric, you've been phenomenal, man. This has been one of our best yet. Where can people find out more about you and everything that you're working on?
Well, it's an honor to be on. Thanks for the platform and the privilege. You can check me out. Kind of a good one-stop shop is 3D Muscle Journey. That's the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. I do a monthly blog post there along with the rest of my teammates. We have a podcast among the 5 of us. I'm on like 3/5 of those episodes typically. And we also have links to my books, The Muscle and Strength Pyramids. The 2nd edition just launched back in January. And we also have links to a monthly research review where I write articles related to bodybuilding, body composition change, auto-regulating resistance training, and also flexible dieting based on recent research. So you can subscribe to that if you want to get your nerd on. And then for more like daily content, you can follow me at Helms3DMJ on Instagram.
At Helms3DMJ. You're the man, brother. We did it again.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Guys, thank you so much for spending your Monday night with us. Have a good one.